Yeah, to start the recording. So I'll go back, introduce somatic methodology, and Richard Strozzi Heckler was the man who founded this methodology. He has a black belt in Aikido, and he's been doing this work for decades. People were talking earlier, we were going, God, it's got to be more than 40 years, it's maybe 50. So he's been at it for a long time working on this. Richard's the founder of the Strozzi Institute, which is based in Petaluma, California. That's where they have their dojo. But what he would say that a dojo, and this is, I think, the definition of a dojo, is any place of learning and awakening through practice. So welcome to the dojo, the Green Light Go dojo. Now we're going to learn about somatic methodology and doing a centering exercise with Pete. So let me go ahead and introduce Pete, our guest of honor. So today we have Pete Hamill. He is a consultant and a facilitator and a coach. He has a background in leadership and organizational development. He's written a book on embodied leadership. He's worked with many organizations. He's senior faculty of the Strozzi Institute. He's living in Brighton, England. So right there on the coast, and there's some palm trees there. So let me just bring people in. There we go. Just introducing Pete here. And just a couple of logistical things before we get started, and I let Pete take it away. If you have any questions, go ahead. There's a chat box, and you can write your questions in the chat box, and I'll go ahead and I'll look at those questions as they're going. And if there's a question that Pete could answer in the moment to clarify something that he's saying, then I'll pass that on to Pete, and I'll tell that to him. Otherwise, I'll hold these questions for the end, and there'll be an opportunity to go through those questions and for you to ask Pete directly any questions that you have. Also, there'll be an opportunity at the end for us to talk about the embodied leadership workshops that we're going to be doing here this fall and early next year here in Barcelona. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to you, Pete, and take her away.
Okay, thank you, Clark. So hi, everybody. My name is Pete Hamill, as Clark has already said, and I'm one of the faculty with Strozzi Institute. I've been working with Strozzi Institute since about 2002, and very quickly discovered that for myself, I felt it was by far and away the most powerful development work that I'd ever come across, to work in a somatic or embodied way. So it's really my pleasure and joy to be able to share that with you today. In terms of what we're going to do today, there's kind of three things that we're going to do broadly on this call. First one is I'm going to give you some level of an understanding of this work, outline a kind of a way of understanding what it is that we're doing and what it means to work in a somatic or an embodied way in leadership development or coaching. So some level of understanding of that. I'm going to share some examples or case studies of people that I've worked with and the kind of experiences that they've had and the kind of development that they've gone through inside of an embodied process, which brings it to life. It tells you kind of what did that mean in practice for an individual. So it gives you some of that. And then the final thing we're going to do is do some practices. We'll start actually engaging in a little bit of this work. I'm going to start talking about the work because I want to create a common contextual understanding before we start doing anything, so that we're starting from a similar place. But you know, this work is very much about actually what do we do from an embodied place. It's not about the talking. It's not about the theory, although we have to talk about the theory in order to get to the work. So that's my intention. And inside of what my kind of offer, or what I think this call can do, is I think by the end of the call, you'll walk away with a very clear sense of how to use a somatic approach, or how to begin using a somatic approach to transform either your leadership or your coaching, or to be able to take that into the leadership development work that you do as a practitioner. I'm aware that people may be joining this from multiple perspectives. But at the very least, all of us plays a leadership role in our own lives. And so there should be some application through directly to that for everybody. Okay. So that's the broad context for what I want to do. To start that off, I guess what I'd like to start off is with the question, have you ever had the experience? And it's kind of one of those that I'm guessing at some level, everybody has had some level of this experience. And it's the experience of knowing that you should do something, but somehow being unable to do it. Yeah? Knowing that you should say no to somebody and being unable to do it. Or sitting around at the end of one of those meetings where somebody has to take on the piece of work that nobody else wants to do, and knowing that you shouldn't say anything, but somehow finding yourself taking the piece of work on. Or knowing that, you know, it could be as simple as knowing that actually, you know, you should be going to the gym, or you should be doing something else, and somehow being unable to do it. Being inhibited in some way to be able to take the action that you know you want to take, that you know you should take, and the knowing of that doesn't seem to make a lot of difference to your ability to take the action. And my guess is that at some level, at some point in our lives, we all run into that. We all have times where knowing what we should or could do or what we would do is not enough to being able to take the action. You know, there's some organizations that I work with where they bring me in because they want the new thing. Kind of like, we've done all this other stuff, now we want something new, and you're doing something new and different, so come in and do something new with us. And so everybody there has read, you know, Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence, but it has not made them any more emotionally intelligent as an organization, the reading of that book. There's a difference between knowing, that cognitive knowing, and the ability to take action in the world. And so the embodied or somatic work is about how do we bridge that gap? How do we very directly, very quickly, and very effectively move from a place of knowing what we should do to being able to take the action to live the life in line with how we want to live our lives, to be a leader in line with how we want to lead, to be a coach in line with how we want to coach, or to be able to bring that capacity to our coaches, to our coachees. So that's essentially the core aspect of this somatic work, is how do we accelerate that move from all these things I know I could, should, would do, to how do I actually start to do them consistently and when under pressure. And that is our definition of learning. Our definition of learning is that we've learned how to do something we were previously unable to do, and that we can do it consistently and under pressure. And the embodied work is about producing that learning. It's very, very direct, very pragmatic, very simple, but not easy. And that's the journey that I want to outline for you today, that I want to take you through and give you a bit of a sense of what we mean by that. So, what stops us from being able to take the action that we know we should do in any particular situation? What is it that prevents us from being able to do something inside of those situations? And I think that's the place that we want to start off, is there's something that's getting in the way. And so how do we understand what's getting in the way as a starting point to doing something different? So one of the things that we know is that when we are in a situation and we're being asked to do something that feels outside of what is comfortable or normal to us, is that often we will run into a visceral sense of discomfort. Yeah, kind of like a visceral feeling inside of our body, inside of our tissues of, oh, that doesn't feel comfortable. I don't like doing that. Ooh, yeah. And we find ourselves withdrawing away from taking that action. You know, there are some people who getting up on a table in a party and dancing on the table is very, very comfortable too. And there are other people for whom that would be viscerally just like, no, I'm never going to do that. It's like there's a way in which we have been shaped and conditioned in our history, which says that that's possible for us or not. That would feel so uncomfortable that there is no way that we are going to do it. And that discomfort, that lives inside of our bodies. And so part of what we do inside of this work is that we start to look at how have we been shaped as a human being into what is normal, what is comfortable, what is acceptable for us. And the combination of all those things that we have been habituated into is our personality. That's basically who we've become. There's a cultural aspect to it, there's a societal aspect to it, there'll be a community and a family aspect to it, and there's a very individual aspect to it. But those are the collection of things that we've been shaped into that are comfortable for us, that are easy for us to do. So for some of us, we'll find ourselves in a situation where conflict emerges inside of a group. And some of us will find ourselves withdrawing. Yeah? Some of us will find ourselves kind of like disengaging, not getting involved, finding ourselves getting out of the situation. Others of us will find ourselves trying to accommodate and trying to placate or peacemake and try to keep everybody happy. Other people might find themselves kind of jumping into the conflict and getting involved. We have these different kind of backgrounds which give us a sense of what's comfortable, what's acceptable, what's allowable. And it's not just, afterwards, if you were to ask somebody, so why did you do what you do? They'd have a rationalization. They'd be able to tell you, oh, here's why I did what I did. Here's the rationalization for it. But the reality is that that's a post-rationalization. That's the rationalization we make up after the event. What happens in the moment is viscerally we're freaking out about the fact that there's a conflict emerging next to us, and we're really not very good at handling conflict. So we're doing whatever we habitually do with conflict. And then afterwards, we make up the reason why. And so that's what we see over time, is that there's a visceral discomfort with a particular situation, and then there's an adaptive behavior that we have learned in order to manage that situation. And that adaptive behavior becomes kind of what we do, what everybody knows about us. It's kind of our identity, our personality in the world. It's how we show up for people. And it may or may not serve us. It may be that that conflict, that we were placating and peacemaking a conflict that actually needed to happen, and that the moving through that conflict would have produced trust and a better outcome. Or it could be that withdrawing from the conflict was absolutely the wrong thing to do, because withdrawing from the conflict meant it could never be resolved because we owned a piece of it. But we weren't able to bring ourselves into that conflict and to be able to deal with it effectively. And we can even know that we need to deal with conflict better. We can know that we should be doing something differently, and yet be utterly unable in the moment to do anything different, because of the sheer level of visceral discomfort that this produces in us. Now, there's a neurobiologist, neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, who studied this work, and he calls these somatic markers. And we all have them. We all have these somatic markers. The best way of describing it is if I ask you to think back to an embarrassing situation that you were in at some point in your life. And if you bring that to mind, what you'll notice is that it doesn't just come to mind as a cognitive memory. Actually, the entire emotions of it start to come back to be present with you. It's like the emotional soundtrack of the experience will replay itself inside of you in that moment. And that's the visceral discomfort. That's the piece that's playing inside of us that says, this isn't safe. Now, in evolutionary terms, this is something that we evolved to do as kind of like a defense mechanism. It was, we walked through a situation and we got attacked by a lion. The next time we were in a similar situation, we were already, at a biological level, our body was already telling us, you're not safe, you're not comfortable. And we would take action to make ourselves comfortable, which would mean producing safety. That's where it comes from. However, this playing out in terms of being embarrassed, it's playing out in terms of cultural rules that we get taught as a child about what we could do or couldn't do. It gets played out for us in terms of the aspects of our personality and how we deal with conflict, or maybe how conflict was dealt with in our family and what we learned about that. All of these different aspects play out for us. Whether or not we step up and make ourselves visible and take leadership in a situation, whether or not we say no to someone in authority. All of those different aspects, we learned all of these things. We learned what was acceptable, what was allowable. And then the somatic markers that are embedded inside of us guide us in our responses. They hold us in a particular pattern of behavior, which is comfortable and normal, by getting free, by playing that kind of discomfort, that visceral discomfort, that historic emotion, which tells us you're not safe, make yourself comfortable. So the starting point of our work is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. The starting point in our work comes with starting to be aware of those places where we get viscerally uncomfortable in response to the world, in response to situations, in response to authority, in response to conflict, in response to life, being aware of that and being with it rather than running away from it into our habitual responses. So that is ultimately the first place that we start in this work, is how do we start to get comfortable with being uncomfortable? How do we start to center ourselves, which is the first practice of this work, and we'll have a go at that in a little while. How do we start to center ourselves in a place where we are feeling viscerally uncomfortable so that we can have choice about the actions that we take, so that we can choose something other than maybe our habitual response, our historic response. So that's kind of, for me, at a basic level, that's the starting point of this work, is to start to interrupt that visceral discomfort, to start to interrupt that compulsive response that we have learned over time, and to get to a place where we can start to choose something different. However, it's not always quite that simple, because if you are going to start practicing doing something different in a situation, it may take a little bit of practice to get good at it. It's quite simple, really. If you want to start engaging with conflict rather than running away from it, the first time you do it may not be particularly sophisticated and elegant and as wonderful as you would want it to be. It may be clumsy, it may be awkward, it may feel weird inside because actually I'm still dealing with my visceral discomfort and I'm trying something new that I've never tried before. So I worked with a HR director at one point. He was for a large company, and he was somebody who, like a lot of men of a certain age in our society, was viscerally uncomfortable with emotions, his own or other people's. And that came from a series of childhood experiences where he was very much told that he had to man up, not get emotional, grow up, big boys don't cry, those types of messages. And so he couldn't be comfortable with his own emotions, which means he couldn't be comfortable with anybody else's emotions. You know, they evoked that level of visceral discomfort that I was talking about. The somatic marker was evoked in him whenever anybody got emotional with him. But his job as a HR director of a company involved dealing with people who were in difficult and challenging situations, who were at times emotional. And what he would do is he would get up and tap them on the shoulder on the way out of the room, saying, "I'll just give you a moment." And he would post-rationalize to himself that what he was doing was for their benefit. He was taking care of them because they wouldn't want to be emotional with somebody else. They would want somebody to do that. But of course, what he realized was that he was doing it for his benefit, that he was doing it because he was viscerally uncomfortable, and that it was freaking him out to be there with their emotion. And that it may or may not be what they needed. It might have been in some circumstances, but it may well not have been. And so the journey of this work is we start off by getting comfortable with the emotions, but then he had to learn how to be empathetic with people. But being empathetic with a 50-year-old man versus a 25-year-old woman at different stages of their career dealing with different issues requires different things. It requires different qualities. It requires you to bring yourself forward in different ways. The age, the generation, the gender, the personality of the other person are all different and require certain different ways of acting in order to produce empathy inside of that relationship. So it's a practice. And so practicing the skills of empathy over time was part of what he then needed to do in order to learn to do that in a skillful way. So this brings us into the entire notion of practices. This work is based upon the idea that you have to practice to get good at anything. You know, it's obvious when you think about playing a musical instrument or getting good at a sport or a martial art. It's obvious you have to go and practice. Leadership seems to be this really strange area that we've decided that we can learn from books and PowerPoint slides. And part of our claim in this work is that, no, you can't. I mean, it's kind of obvious. Leadership is a performance art. It is about what you are able to do in the moment with other people. It is not about what you are able to intellectually know. Therefore, as a performance art, it requires practice. And so the essence of this work is that we first need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable so that we can make a choice, but we then need to start practicing a different way of being in the world. We need to start practicing bringing forth different qualities. Now, let's talk about practices a little bit more, because there's a couple of claims and a question that we would have around practices that I think are really important. The first claim we would say is you're always practicing something. Actually, you're always practicing many things. So right now, you're all practicing a way of listening to webinars. Some of you may well be listening from a very skeptical or cynical place. Some of you may well be listening from a very open or accepting place. There's no right or wrong here, by the way. It's just we have a way of listening. And we have a way of listening to people on this type of webinars. If we've done enough of them, there will be a particular way of listening that we'll have for people on these webinars. You're also practicing your way of sitting at the moment. If you're listening to this later while driving, you're also practicing a way of driving. There'll be all sorts of practicing that is going on while you're doing what you're doing. Sitting here, I'm practicing a way of sitting at the moment. I'm practicing a way of communicating and trying to articulate this work. And I'm practicing a way of doing that while connecting with people through a virtual means. So we're all practicing different things. And we are all living in practices. In fact, the sum of our practices represent an interpretation of what it is to be human. That's what Heidegger said many years ago. The sum of our practices represent an interpretation of what it is to be human. So part of what we're doing here is we're starting to go, actually, who I am is the sum of my practices. And that will be our second claim. You are what you're practicing. You are what you're practicing. If you're practicing a different way of engaging, a particular way of listening, a particular way of relating in the world, then that is who you become. That is who you are. You know, our personality is the sum of the things that we have collectively practiced. So you are what you're practicing, and you're always practicing something. You're always practicing many things, actually. The question then becomes, is what you're practicing aligned with what you care about? Is it actually moving you towards what you care about? One of the things I remember Richard shared on a course many, many years ago, this was back probably in about 2003 or 2004. I remember him saying it. It's like, you know, if you want to know what you're committed to, have a look at how you spend your time and how you spend your money. It's like, okay, yeah, you know, really, okay, yes, that has an impact. And it's the essence of this, you know, if you want to know what you're committed to, look at what you're practicing. And that includes how you spend your time and how you spend your money. It includes how you engage with people. How do you connect with people? You know, part of my world is that I work a lot in the corporate domain, and I kind of spend a certain amount of time, therefore, sitting in corporate lobbies, waiting for people to come and meet me who I'm having a meeting with or a coaching session with or whatever. And it's really fun to observe people in corporate lobbies and how they come down and they connect and they engage with other people that they're meeting. And it really, you see their personalities visible, writ large, in terms of how they do it. Their practices are available and visible. So part of what we say in this work is you're always practicing something. You're always practicing something. And those collection of practices is who you are. They represent who you are in the world, your personality, your identity, how other people see you and engage with you. That's how that is in the world. And so when we talk about working with practices inside of this work, and practices for empathy or practices for engaging in conflict differently, what we're doing is transformative work. What we're doing is paying attention to what are the somatic markers that arise inside of us? What are the places where we feel conditioned by our history, conditioned in a particular way of being, where we feel viscerally uncomfortable if we act outside of that conditioned way of being? So what are they? How do we start to be with that discomfort? How do we start to take a different choice? And how do we start to practice a different way of being in the world so that at some point in time, we can get to the place where we are as good at that as we are at what we've historically practiced. And we can do that habitually and when under pressure. And that's the level of learning, as I said at the start of this webinar, that's the level of learning we're concerned about in this work. How do we get to a place where we can consistently, habitually do something different that we currently can't do, and that we can do it under pressure? So I'll give you an example of a client I work with, just to kind of put this into context and to give you an example of it. So let me call him John. It's not his name, but it's kind of, just gives us a name to work with. So John is a senior partner in a professional services firm, a big professional services firm. And he's client facing, so he has to engage with all of his clients. And he got a new client. This was about 3 or 4 years ago when we started working together. He got a new client. It was his first big lead client partner role within the firm, which was a big deal for him. It was a step up inside of his career. And the chief financial officer, who was his client of this firm, was a bully who shouted and swore and banged the table and slammed doors and all of that kind of stuff. And my client, John, was probably the most conflict-averse person you've ever met in your life. It's like, for him, this was his worst nightmare, to have to deal with somebody like this. I mean, this was just horrendous for him, because every ounce of his being wanted to crawl out the door backwards whenever this guy started shouting and swearing and banging the table and all of this kind of stuff. It was just horrendous for him. And so he would collapse and diminish and withdraw and energetically withdraw and disappear in the room. And the team of people he was leading, who were sitting around him or beside him, were looking to him to take leadership in this situation, and he wasn't taking it, because he was so viscerally freaked out based on his own family background with conflict that he could not be present. He could not be there. He could not make a choice. He could not deal with this productively. All he knew how to do was to withdraw. And so far up to that point in his life, he'd been able to just withdraw from these situations of conflict without consequence. But here he was in a situation where he couldn't do that. He could not just withdraw from this without consequence. He had to make a choice, really. He had to show up. And he did not know how to do that. He knew that he needed to. He wanted to. He wanted to stand up to this guy. He knew as well, he was insightful enough to see that his complete withdrawal was provoking the guy on the other side of the table even more and getting him more angry. So he could see that, but he wasn't able to do anything about it. So he was exactly in the situation that I described at the start. He knew he needed to do something different. He could see what it was that he needed to do, but he was utterly unable to take that action, to produce that different way of being in the world. So I started working with him, and we worked together for, I'd say probably about 18 months over time. But I started working with him for him to explore the way in which he was responding to conflict, and the way in which he could start to become more aware of his own embodied response to conflict. Because, of course, he was collapsing, withdrawing, and physically making himself smaller. And all of, when I kind of did that, you probably all could see it. And when I describe it, we can all, everybody else could see it. But he couldn't see it. He couldn't see that that's what he was doing. And here's the thing, most of us don't. We can see sometimes other people's stuff, but we rarely see our own stuff. So he was withdrawing and collapsing and moving away, but he couldn't see that he was doing it. He couldn't see that he was making himself smaller. So, and he was also unaware of the visceral discomfort that he was experiencing inside. He was really, at some level, he knew he really didn't like conflict, but he was so much living in his head and his intellectual world, and about how this guy was wrong for doing this to him, and about how blah, 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 that he wasn't really in touch with the visceral discomfort that he was experiencing. So the starting point of our work was to just get in touch with that, was to spend more and more time in contact with that discomfort, and to give him a way of being in contact with that without being overwhelmed by it. To learn how to be in contact with the discomfort, with the sense of visceral panic almost that was evoked within him around conflict, but from a place where he didn't lose his ability to be resourceful and not to be overwhelmed. And so that was the starting point of our work, was building that capacity. How do I just build the capacity to be aware of and be in touch with this without being overwhelmed by it, maintaining my own sense of my own self and identity? And part of that meant that he wasn't collapsing back into himself and reshaping himself and hiding away, but it was actually he was learning to center himself and to be able to control his metabolism to some degree, so that he wasn't getting so worked up and energized that he wasn't able to have presence of mind. Then the next part of our work was around starting to learn different responses to conflict. And so we had a number of things that we had to do around that. So part of it is like, you know, the place to start learning this wasn't in his most important client relationship, because that's a bit too risky. So we started off looking at other places that he could practice in life, places where he could hold a disagreement with somebody or take a stand for a particular point of view without consequence. So one of the things that we decided was that actually he took a lot of taxis in London, the black taxis in London. And black taxi drivers always like to have a conversation with you about whatever politically is going on at the moment, whatever's at the front of the news. And so his job was to hold an alternative point of view to the taxi driver for the length of the taxi ride, and to stay in that alternative point of view for, it didn't matter what he really believes. That's not the point. The point was just to center himself, to be able to be with his own discomfort and to hold a different point of view, and to practice making different moves, making different conversational moves, making different somatic moves. They're actually the same thing, but I'll get to that later. So holding that different perspective and practicing that over time, so that when he was then engaged with his client, he could start to bring forth different qualities. He could start to be with his client and not collapse and not disappear. And that he could start to deal with that client in a different way. Now, I worked with him, I guess, for about 18 months on building those kind of capabilities, on developing his capacity to really to understand his historical shaping, to be in touch with it, to be okay with the discomfort of it, and then to practice different qualities, different skills that he could bring into conflict, taking a stand for his own perspective, asking inquiring questions as a way of diffusing the conflict, empathizing with the other person's point of view in conflict. All of these were kind of some of the skills that we worked on how he could do and what he could do. I met up with him maybe about a year ago, and at that point in time, he was moving on in the firm in terms of moving to bigger clients and being a client lead partner of a global account. As this was a UK national account, he was moving to being a global lead partner. And he was handing his client over to somebody else. And the person he was handing it over to, they went to a meeting with the client, and the client started to get angry again and did what he did, you know, because wasn't ever going to change him. He just does what he does. So he did what he did. And afterwards, the partner he was handing the client over to said to him afterwards, like, you handled that really, really well. I'm so impressed. You deal with conflict so amazingly well. I have to learn from you how to deal with conflict. So it's really interesting that after that period of time, he got to the place where somebody didn't see it as a learned skill. The other person was basically saying to him, it's like, wow, naturally, you know, it's kind of like this natural thing that you have, that you naturally deal with conflict perfectly. And I really need to learn that because I'm not as good naturally. You know that thing that people do where when they see somebody doing something really well, they say it must be a natural skill for them because I can't do it. But it was practice. And it was practice based around after addressing the historical shaping and the way he'd become. So that, for me, is kind of like a story about what this work is capable of producing. It's capable of moving somebody from a place of utter inability to engage effectively in a particular context or situation to being at a high level of mastery in that situation through practice. Because what we know in life is that the only way you get good at something is through practice. And the only way you get to mastery is through practice. Some of us have just had backgrounds that given us more practice on certain things, so we've gotten better at those things. But we all have things that we look at and other people and go, wow, they do that really well. I wish I could do that. And the only way to get there is through practice. So that's when we talk about practice in this work, that's really what we're looking at. Now, this work is therefore a really hard sell, because I've just told you two things that make this work a really hard sell. First thing is you've got to be uncomfortable. Second thing is you've got to start practicing something that you're not good at. And who likes starting off practicing something that you're not good at and stepping into the domain of being incompetent, where it can be messy and awkward and difficult and all of that stuff. And so, you know, I think this work can evoke stuff for people. It's like, you know, we're saying, you know, you've got to do stuff that is difficult and uncomfortable, and that through that you can really learn to be masterful at something. But, you know, the reason why I valued this work so much when I first heard about it was because I'd been through a series of workshops and seminars of, you know, give me your weekend and we'll change your life. And when I got to this work, I thought, wow, this feels honest. You know, it's going to involve being uncomfortable. It's going to involve practice. That feels honest, and it's going to take time. And one of the reasons that I love this work and I'm passionate about it is because it's honest. You can get to mastery in whatever you want to get to mastery in, and there's a path to do that. And the path is very simple, and it's been laid out for anybody who's ever learned a musical instrument or learned a martial art or got good at any sport. It's been laid out there over time. And that's it. That's the path. And so our work here is about bringing that path to leadership development. And we've all been shaped in interesting ways over time. Our backgrounds, our history have shaped us in really interesting ways. So we've got to deal with that shaping and then learn to be able to take up a different shape in life. Learn to be able to bring a different quality forward. So I've talked for a while now. I'm not sure if any questions have come up in the chat window. I don't think so. So I'm going to suggest we use this as an opportunity to step into doing some practices and to do our first practice of this work, which is our centering practice. And so there's always a point in this work where we kind of, we lay out some theoretical foundations and then we go, okay, let's do it. And so that's this point. So what I'm going to invite you to do is to stand up if you can. If you're in a place where you're standing, you can stand up. That would be great. If you're listening to this while driving a car, please just continue driving as normal. Take care of yourselves. But if you're in a place where you can stand up, let's stand up. We're going to go through a centering practice. And the reason why we do this standing up as a starting point is because it's much easier to have a greater somatic awareness from a standing position. It's much easier to have a greater felt sense of how you're holding yourself inside of your body, of how you're holding your muscles across the different parts of your body when we're standing up than it is when we're sitting down and some of our bodies being supported in a chair or whatever it is we're sitting on. So I'm going to start off and just invite you to just drop into your felt sense, drop out of your head and into your body and feel into what's going on inside of you in this moment. You might notice your kind of emotional state, your mood. You might notice some aches and pains. You know, maybe some of you have been sitting in front of a computer screen all day and notice some shoulder pain or whatever it is. So just start to notice, well, you know, what's there, what's alive inside of your body. And then we're going to start off centering along the first dimension. And the first dimension that we center along in this work is the dimension of length. So we're going to look at what does it mean to be centered in length. We'll exist in three kind of spatial domains, at least that we know of anyway. But we exist in three spatial domains. So first of all, centering in the domain of length. How we center in length is we start to pay attention to our balance in length. And what we mean by that is our extension upwards and our relaxation downwards. So if you can imagine, first of all, that somebody's pulling on a hair on the top of your head and just pulling your spine and extending some air between the vertebrae, moving from something like this to something like this. Well, you just put a little bit of air between the vertebrae and you stand fully in the length that you were given. Not holding up your neck or your chin, keeping your chin level, but at the same time, just allowing your spine to be its full length. If you get nothing else from today, this will be really good for your back and your spine. And as a friend of mine says, you're as young as your spine is healthy. So it's always a good thing to pay attention to. So we're extending upwards, and the next point is relaxing down. So one of the things that we can find is that over time we hold tension in horizontal bands across the body. And so one of the first horizontal bands that we hold tension in is the forehead. And we can hold tension in the forehead either by holding up our eyebrows, having a little bit of a surprised look on our head, or by scrunching them in and looking a little bit angry. So just finding that place where your forehead is relaxed, somewhere in between. And then relaxing our eyes. The next one is the ocular band, relaxing our eyes. And your eyes are relaxed when your peripheral vision is open. When you can see what's going on either side of you without having to turn your head. And the eyes are relaxed. Then we relax the jaw. And the jaw is relaxed when the back teeth aren't touching. For some people that's news. You know, the body is designed so the back teeth aren't meant to be touching all the time. That's kind of the design. And so for some of us, that can be new information. So that's often a sign that we're holding a lot of tension in our jaw. Next one is the shoulders. And just raise your shoulders up, hold a little bit of tension, and then let them go. Oh, that's nice. And see if you can feel the weight of your arms at your shoulders. It can be a nice feeling, that. And then relaxation into the chest. And the chest is relaxed when we're neither kind of projecting ourselves out in the world like we have an armor here, nor are we collapsing back in and protecting our heart. But we're kind of in that place somewhere in between where we can be open-hearted and maybe even a little bit vulnerable, available to other people for connection and relationship. Next one is the stomach. So we relax in the stomach. Again, for many of us, this can be a place where we can tighten and crunch on our stomach and hold a lot of tension here. So just let that go and relax. And we go down into the sphincters. Again, a place where we can hold on and hold a lot of tightness. Again, it's a place where we can relax. We don't need to be permanently clenching. And then down into our legs. And we know our legs are relaxed when our knees are soft. Somewhere between being bent and locked. That place in between. That gives us a sense that our knees are relaxed and our legs are relaxed. And then finally, our feet. There's some people who kind of clench the earth with their feet. So just finding that place where your feet can relax if you're one of those people. So we're extending upwards and we're relaxing downwards. We say in this work that the length is the domain of dignity. And the reason we say that is that if you've ever seen a dancer on stage, they tend to have perfect posture. They hold themselves with a perfect posture and they're relaxed. And what you see in that is you see dignity. And what we also know is that when you do something that takes away on somebody's dignity, the first thing they do is they collapse in length. So there's a way that we know that this is about holding ourselves with dignity. And there's a question for us here, which is, how do we expect other people to hold us with dignity if we don't hold ourselves with dignity? So this is the domain of dignity. The next one we have is the domain of width, the next of the spatial dimensions we live in. And so part of what we want to do here is start to look at two things. The first is our balance. How are we balancing ourselves left to right? You know, often we have a dominant side, a side that we put more weight on. People women who've been mothers to children often have a side they were used to carrying the child on, and therefore a way in which they balance their weight. So how do we find a place where we're balanced left to right, where our weight is equally distributed between the left foot and the right foot? The other aspect of width is, are we taking up the space that we're due to take up in the world? You know, there's a whole group of people who hold themselves very tight. They hold their legs tight. They hold their arms tight in. They don't take up a lot of space. They're contracting themselves inwards in order to be more narrow in the domain of width. And if we're not holding our boundaries with the world, then other people will come in and push on our boundaries. So if we're holding ourselves in very tight, it's an invitation to people to come in and push on our boundaries. And there are certain people in the world who hold themselves out here and who push boundaries. And we see that people get into these relationships and these constellations where one person is pushing boundaries and the other person isn't holding boundaries. And so the conversation of how we hold appropriate width, how we allow ourselves where our feet are the same width apart as our shoulders, where we're not holding ourselves in, where we're allowing ourselves to fill up from the inside and meet our own boundaries. So just feel into your ribcage and allow it to meet your own boundaries. That holding ourselves in this space is part of how we hold appropriate boundaries in the world. And that's a real conversation in the organizational domain and the leadership domain. How do we hold boundaries? And there's a whole group of us who don't know how to do that. That's the domain of width. It's the social domain. It's the domain of relationship with other people and holding effective boundaries with other people. Finally, we have the domain of width, or depth, sorry, just done width. Domain of depth, the last of the spatial dimensions that we live in. And so in the domain of depth, what we notice is that, as human beings, the majority of sense organs are on the front of our bodies. We have a tendency to orient towards the future as being ahead of us and the past as being behind us. And so that creates a way of relating to the world. There are some people, and you can see them often when they're driving, who can't quite get there fast enough. They're leaning over the steering wheel, trying to get there just a little bit faster. If they put their neck forward that bit further, they'll get there just that millisecond quicker. And then there are other people for whom the world is just coming at them a little bit too fast, and they're leaning away from the world. And they're kind of, leaning away, and it's a bit coming at me a bit too much. So we see that how we're relating to the world and whether or not we're hanging out in the past, going over our history, kind of going over what just happened, or we're engaged in the future and on to the next thing and moving forward and not engaged with the past. We can see those patterns in terms of how we're holding ourselves. And so part of what we want to do is to find that place where we find our balance, the balance in our weight between the heels and the balls of our feet, so that we bring ourselves into the present moment. And we allow ourselves to arrive into the present. So just do that. Just allow yourself to bring yourself into the present moment. Find that place of balance. So we're balancing around length, we're balancing around width, we're balancing around depth. When we do this, when we relax down and we hold our body like this, we're kind of holding ourselves the way our body was designed to hold ourselves. We're not using our surface muscles to hold ourselves up. We're using the skeleton and some of the core muscles. We're essentially allowing ourselves to be aligned with our body's biological design, if you like. That's part of what we're doing here. The final thing that we're going to do in this place is we're going to start to pay attention to the body's center of gravity. So in doing that, I'm going to ask you to pay attention to a point which is about an inch or two below your navel. And so I'll invite you I'll show you, put your hand at that point, just so that you feel, you put your thumb just about where your navel is and put your hand there. Your hand will kind of rest at the point where your center of gravity is. And this is our center. And so just bring your attention to that point, to that place, so you can feel your hand behind in your body. You can feel it at that point behind the skin. And then let your hand drop away, but keep your attention there. And just take a moment to notice how it is, being balanced in length, in width, and depth, and having your attention on your center. Now, Clark, can you unmute everyone? And we'll just ask you in a word or two, what do you notice in this place? It doesn't have to be long, just a word or two, what do you notice? Hold on, we're just unmuting everybody still. Here's me assuming that this is a simple, easy flicking of a switch, but I don't know that it is.
They might have to unmute themselves.
You might have to unmute yourself. So whoever would be willing to. No, I think Ramon's trying to unmute himself and it's not working.
Peace.
Aha! Yes.
Peace.
Yes.
In a peaceful state.
Peaceful state. Peaceful state. Sorry, I thought you said Pete. A peaceful state. Yeah, lovely. Thank you. What else? In a word or two. Somebody else. What do you notice?
Breath.
Breath. Did I get that right, Adam?
Yes, you did.
Adam, breath. So you're noticing your breath, more awareness of your breath. Anybody else?
There is calmness and stillness.
Calmness and stillness. Lovely. Thank you.
Presence.
Presence. Yeah. So being present in the present moment.
Harmony.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Harmony. I feel harmony. Can you hear?
I can hear you, but I haven't understood what you've said, Ramon. Sorry.
Harmony.
Harmony. Yes, lovely. Thank you. Yeah. So one of the things that I want to speak to about the centering is that centering is not always a place where you will feel calmness, harmony. It's not a Zen pill, basically, if you understand the analogy. If you center when you're grieving, you will experience your grief. If you center when you're angry, you will experience your anger. If you center when you're joyful, you will experience your joy. So centering is not a means by which to go to a place of calmness. Now, often when we do this on a kind of something like this, often we get a lot of calmness because here we are in this place and we're together and there's nothing, you know, we can have a lot of calmness here. We're doing something outside of the world for a moment and we're enjoying being in this work and working together in this way. And so we can experience that. And in life, we may or may not experience calmness. Sometimes we will, but sometimes we'll experience other things. And I think that's one of the really important things about this work is that part of our aim in this is not to numb those feelings, but to experience those feelings from a place where we have choice over our response to them. And that's the essence of this work. How can we start to experience them from a place of choicefulness rather than from a place of compulsively doing whatever habitual response we've habitually done. So I think that's a really important thing to say. The other thing that I'd say is that in this experience, what often people notice is a sense of the busyness of the mind has gone for a moment. It's like that little voice inside of our head that can second guess us and doubt us and kind of, you know, be utterly unhelpful at times. As we diminish that, we quieten that down and we go to a different place, a place where we can feel something else, where our anxieties about the past or our worries about the future, those kind of things have just been quietened a bit. And we can be just somewhere in the present, be in a different space where we can relate to what's happening in this moment. And I think that's one of the real gifts that's available through centering, is that we bring ourselves into a different state of being. It's interesting that McKinsey wrote a piece maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, where they said in looking at leadership development, the most important thing going forward was no longer, in their view, trait awareness or psychological trait awareness or kind of psychological profile awareness, if you like, you know, whatever psychometric you prefer. They said the core thing going forward was going to be state awareness. How do we be aware of and manage our state in the moment in our relations and interactions with other people? And that was their view on what was kind of the most important quality going forward in terms of leadership development. And I'd say, great, you know, it's from my perspective, it's great they're catching up, as that's the essence of this work. Did you want to ask something there? I think it was, sorry. No, okay. So you put your hand up. I was just checking if you were trying to say something. So that's the essence of what centering is about. The thing that I'd say is, like, what happens in life, of course, is that life will knock us off center. you know, there is no ability to go centered and stay centered for all time, because life will happen. You'll get one of those emails, you know, those emails that if you're having a good day, you type your response and then save it before sending it and go back to it when you've calmed down. So you'll get one of those emails. Or the boss will say, can I see you in my office, in that particular tone? Or something you've been working on will not work out the way that you wanted it to. So that stuff still happens. So we'll get knocked off center. The question is, how quickly can we come back? And that's the game that we're playing, is how quickly can we bring ourselves back? Because, you know, we know that there are people who something happened to, they get knocked off center, and it's taken them years. Maybe even the rest of their lives, they've kind of been knocked off by it and they've never been able to recover their center around it. We've probably all known people like that. So part of what we're looking at is, how do we bring ourselves back? And how do we bring ourselves back quickly? Now, centering is appropriated from the martial arts, believe it or not. Because of course, if somebody's going to try to hit you, you're going to see your basic defensive reactions. You know, you're going to see it, and you have to learn to do something else. And the first part of learning to do something else is learning how not to do what you've historically done. So in martial arts, we use centering as a way to not do what you've historically done. And it's the place of choice. It's the place of being able to respond differently. And the martial art of Aikido, Clark mentioned at the start that Richard Strozzi Heckler, he's I think 7th or 8th dan black belt in Aikido. You know, the founder, centering is key to Aikido. And he told me the story that the founder of Aikido, Morihei Ueshiba, was asked by one of his students at one time, how did he remain so centered all the time? And his response was, I just come back before you've noticed. And that's mastery of centering. Mastery of centering is not about trying to maintain center all the time. Mastery of centering is, can you experience life and bring yourself back? Bring yourself back, bring yourself back, bring yourself back. And that's a practice. And so inside of our work, we're continually practicing centering. How do we experience life and bring ourselves back repeatedly, consistently over time, in order to be able to bring forth a different choice about what it is we want to bring to the world? So many of you have been standing for a little while. I invite you to sit back down. And there's some more I could say, but I think at this moment, I'd like to open it up in terms of questions. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, and then maybe I'll say some stuff towards the end to sum up. So is there any questions that anybody would like to ask about anything that I've shared? You may be on mute if you're trying to speak. Just checking.
Yeah, I'll try and unmute you. Raise your...
Okay, so no questions at the moment. So what I'm going to do then is go on a little bit and talk a little bit about what I've referred to so far as shipping. And, you know, I've talked about it as our conditioning over time, the way in which we've been shaped over time. Now, there's somebody on the call who has their speaker on that's producing an echo. So could I just invite you to put your selves on mute if you're not talking? Ah, perfect, that's it gone. Lovely. I'm just hearing myself come back in a way that's slightly disconcerting. So it's nice just to not have that. So yes, I've talked about shaping and conditioning over time. So I want to talk a little bit more about what do we really mean by that? So let's talk about how a somatic marker might be formed. So I want you to imagine a scenario of a situation in which I talked a little bit earlier about the HR director who couldn't be comfortable around emotions. So at some point in his childhood, he learned that him getting emotional was bad and wrong, basically. Some version of bad or wrong. And he learned that through experiences he had where he was told to man up, to grow up, to to be a man, to whatever it was. So he was given those kind of messages. And so what he learned to do as a child was to suppress his emotions. Now, intellectually or as a conversational, in the talking therapies, we often talk about repression of emotions or suppression of emotions or retroflexion of emotions, whatever it is. So there are ways in which people hold back their emotions. But there's a way of looking at that which is entirely somatic. It's entirely embodied. And so that is, if you want to hold back your emotions, you hold back your tears, there's a series of things that you do in order to do that. To operationally do that, there are some things that you will do. You will tighten on your diaphragm. You will bring your breathing up into your upper chest. You will tighten around your jaw and throat, and you will tighten around the eyes. And that does two things. It blocks the expression of the emotion, but it also limits the flow of blood and hormones around the endocrine system and around the muscles in a way that stops you experiencing the emotion to the same degree. Yeah. So we limit the degree to which we're numbing ourselves. When we hold that tension and hold ourselves in that way, we're numbing that particular emotion. And so what we see is that if we, for example, for this person, if that happens repeatedly or in a particularly traumatic moment, what happens is they learn an habitual response to hold themselves inside of those contractions. So that, when the somatic marker of somebody else crying happens in their world, they will massively tighten up there, but they've practiced it so much, or they learned it at such a traumatic moment that there's almost like a permanent holding that's always there. And that's why the man who hasn't expressed emotion in 45 years is because they're holding that tension over so much time. Now, we can engage with that from a talking therapy place as a repression of emotions, as I said. Or what we can do is have the person relax their diaphragm, breathe a bit more deeply, relax around the jaw and throat, relax around the eyes, and all of a sudden they'll feel all this sadness. And then their somatic marker will play out, they'll freak out, and they'll tense up again because they haven't yet learned to be comfortable with it. So part of the reason I say that is that basically all aspects of our personality can be mapped that way. The response to conflict that's learned over time, the withdrawal from conflict, was learned in the guy that I referred to as a permanent slight withdrawal from the world, as a permanent level of disengagement, permanent watching the world from a slightly withdrawn place, as a slight spectator observer trying to check out if it's safe. Yes, whenever the conflict emerged, he would do more of it and he would collapse inside of himself, but there was a level of it that was a permanent shape. And I say literally a physical shape that he inhabited in his body that gave him his identity in the world, and it gave him his sense of his experience in the world. There's a great Charlie Brown cartoon, which I use in my book and often use when I'm presenting, which is, this idea that Charlie Brown's talking about how, he needs to remain with his shoulders slumped and slumped inside of himself, because if you're going to get any joy to being depressed, the last thing you can do is stand up straight, And there's a way in which the mood that we carry within inside ourselves is reflective of our shape. And when we've learned an habitual shaping, like the shape of withdrawal from conflict or the shape of unable to express emotions, there's a mood that goes alongside that. And inside that mood, there are certain emotions that are available to us. There are certain possibilities that are available to us. If we live inside a mood of possibility and ambition, there's a different set of actions, possibilities, emotions that are available to us, conversations that are available to us, than if we live inside of a mood of negativity or depression or resignation. And so what we see is that this holding, the shaping that we have is the set of practices that we are in. We hold ourselves inside of practices that express who we are in the world. It does two things for us. It gives us an internal reality where certain things are possible for us and certain things are impossible for us. We're responding differently from conflict. Even if I know I want to respond differently to conflict, I can't. And it also gives us an identity in the world because other people are seeing it and responding to it. You know, the phenomenon or the idea that kind of kids and animals know if you're angry before you do. Like, they're reading it, they're seeing it. Well, here's the scary thing, is that we're all reading each other all the time. Now, some of us are more aware than others, and some of us give more or less credence to what we're reading of others and not. But we all know and experience when somebody is incongruent. We all know and experience the times where we meet somebody and we naturally trust them or we naturally distrust them. We all know and experience that there are times where we're able to engage easily with people, and there are times where we find ourselves withdrawing or freaked out by them. So we are visible. This is the scary bit, is that our histories are writ on our bodies. And if you start as a practitioner or a coach or a developer of other people, or even as a leader, if you start paying attention, you'll see other people. You'll see their histories. You'll see the expression of who they are is alive and visible in their bodies, in the basic structure of how they hold themselves. And we are visible. We are visible to other people. They can see in the basic structure of how we hold ourselves, our traumas, our histories. They may not understand the details, they may not understand why, they may not understand what it is they're reacting to, but there will be something that they're seeing and experiencing. So all of us like to have an image of ourselves inside of our heads that we hope is what everybody else has inside of their heads, and that we kind of go away and polish occasionally, and kind of, we have that image that we love. And this is the kind of the oh no moment of this work, is that actually we're much more visible to other people than we like to think we are. And so part of this work addresses that very directly. Part of it, in this work, we start to learn to be able to read other people. And we start to look at where are the places where we are incongruent to other people. Where are the places where we're not producing trust in our relationships with other people? Where are the places where people are finding weird reactions to us because they're finding us a little bit weird or a little bit goofy or out ahead of ourselves or not focused or whatever it is. So we're starting to look at how do we start to see some of those things. And so a real part of this work, a real element of this work, is starting to deepen our own awareness of how we are showing up in the world, how we are facing and experiencing the world, what our collective identity is in terms of what other people hold to be true about us. And how do we start to take ownership of that and start to look at how do we create an identity which produces the kind of leadership that we want to express in the world. Now, why would we want to do that? Not to manipulate other people or anything like that, because sometimes that's what people will have concerns about. And why would we want to spend all this time getting really uncomfortable and starting to practice all these new things? Well, we do that in service of what we most care about. And so the last thing in our centering process, which we get onto in the program, is we center around what we most care about as a leader or as a coach or a leader in our lives, whatever it is. What are we committed to? And, very much the question inside of this work is a very pragmatic question. Is like, what are you committed to? What are you committed to as a leader to make, create, change, make happen in the world, whatever it is? What are you committed to? And who do you need to be in order to be able to deliver on that commitment? And then how do we start in a process of cultivating a self that can deliver on that can produce trust and relationship with people whereby you can achieve that, what it is you care about, that can take the difficult actions that need to be taken, that can have the difficult conversations, that can deal with conflict appropriately in order to move forward the things that you care about. So that's where it all starts to come together inside of this work. It comes back to a very pragmatic piece around what are you up to in the world? What do you care enough about to want to do some deep work that will allow you to move towards the future that you care about? Now, often, as you can imagine, people don't come into this work with a pre-written, pre-prepared, well thought out, wonderful answer to that question. Often the answer to that question is part of the exploration. And it's part of the work. How do we start to get in touch with what we truly care about? Have we so are we so living in our intellectual rational space that where the body is just a machine that takes our head from meeting to meeting, that we're not really in touch with our emotions enough to know what we really truly care about? You know, for some people, that's the starting point. So we need to build a level of somatic awareness, because our emotions live inside our body, and our emotions tell us what we really care about. It all happens below the chin. So we've got to build that somatic awareness as part of understanding what we care about, in order to then be able to start to cultivate the self that will be able to deliver on what we care about. Okay, so I've talked again for a little while. So I want to open it up and see if that provokes any more questions or provokes any new questions.
I think people can unmute themselves if they have a question. Or you wowed them with your talking. You wowed me.
Well, thank you, Clark. So no questions at the moment. Okay, so what I'd say, is a way of summing up. We talked about the shaping. Individuals have a shape. Teams have a collective shaping. This is where it gets really interesting. Teams have a collective shaping and a collective response to pressure, just as individuals do. You can see it. Some teams collapse under pressure. Some teams, go back to individuals rather than being a team. You can see the team response under pressure. You can see organizations will have responses under pressure, somatic responses to pressure. So when we do this work, we work at an individual level. On our programs, we're very much working with a group of individuals who come together and working with them on their their individual development as leaders or as coaches. We also do this work with teams, working on their shaping as a team. What's their team's response? How do they collectively respond inside of that team? And then we also do work at our organizational level, where we start to look at what's the organizational responses and what ways is that being lived inside of the organization, and how can we start to interrupt that and start to enable a different set of responses. So that's the essence of our work, is bridging that gap between things that I know I should do to how do I effectively do them under pressure at the individual, team, or organizational level. And we develop coaches who are able to bring that work to their clients. Okay, so that I think is probably as much as I want to say right now. Clark, do you want to talk about the program in October and some of the logistics around that?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that. Thank you very much, Pete. Like I said, always inspire me, and your wisdom always comes through. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So yeah, of course we have some of the somatic work coming to Barcelona. We've had it before, and we're back. Greenlight Go is sponsoring Embodied Leadership in October. They're 4 days long. They are co-led. Pete's going to be one of the leaders, along with Gazina Wintel in October. And then we have another Embodied Leadership one in February 2020. The dates for that one are February 27th to March 1st. And then we culminate with the Embodied Leadership 2 in May 28th through 31 in 2020. These are really interactive workshops. And like you said, Pete, it is you have to be willing to put yourself into a place of discomfort with learning new things and what comes up. And so it's a great dojo for getting this kinds of information, this important information about your own body and the way it responds, and how to be aware so that you make another response. There are some great exercises during the course of 4 days. It builds. There's a really fun and chaotic, what's called a rondori, that can't be missed. So yeah, that's kind of the logistics of it. We have a really beautiful space that we use at the Hotel Front Maritime. We have a great garden that we can go outside, and of course we're near the sea. Yeah, I don't know much more to say about the courses. I mean, there's a lot of information on the greenlightgo.es website. Sergio, what do you want? Sergio's right here. He doesn't want to talk. but Sergio is available to answer any questions you have about this, and so am I, and can always contact us. And for the people who are on this call now, we're offering a 5% discount for the Embodied Leadership 1.
Cool. Just in terms of some of what we cover in that course, it's probably fair to say. So we do spend time looking at declarations in terms of, that's our word for what it is you care about as a leader, what you're committed to making happen in the world. So we spend some time getting clear on those. We spend a lot of time developing somatic awareness and practicing centering. And there's a number of foundational practices that we teach to develop our own ability to be aware of how it is we learn through an embodied sense, understanding how we learn, understanding how to be centered in motion, understanding how to be more powerful in the world, how to take up power in the world, understanding how to give power in the world, which is an equally important part of that. Learning how to be able to somatically assess people, which is to start to see people's history as it lives inside of their bodies. So we do some work around developing those capacities. We do some work around what it is to take a stand for our own dignity, and what it is to be with somebody taking a stand for their own dignity. And how do we start to develop our capacity to be in those types of really challenging conversations at times. We spend some time looking at what happens when life gets chaotic. You know, those days where everything's just coming at you from every direction. How do we start to be able to maintain some sense of choice in the midst of chaotic action? We have some practices around understanding the core conditioning that we have in response to pressure, the kind of the deepest core bit that grips us from our past, so that we can start to manage it and work with it more effectively. Because we all have stuff that lives inside of us. So we do some work around knowing, how does that show up inside of us? And even if I intellectually, cognitively know about it, how does it live inside of my body, inside of my life, and how does it take its impact on me? So we do a lot of work around really deepening and understanding and seeing that and building the capacity of choice inside of that. We look at some of the moves that we need to make in life around how to make a powerful request, how to decline somebody, how to decline a request without declining the person, which is a really important distinction. How do we actually learn to move gracefully inside of some of those core moves? So that's just to give you a flavor of some of the things that we cover inside of this. If you're interested in this from a coaching perspective, it's a prerequisite before starting the coaching work. The core essence is you don't get to start coaching anybody with this work until you do the work on yourself. It makes sense. So the request in terms of from a coaching perspective is you come and you experience this stuff for yourself. However, if you are a coach, what you'll be able to do, and you probably will do, is start to observe other people and start to see and experience how people and bodies go through change. I use those words like they're separate, but they're actually the same. But you'll see how the body goes through change as part of a person's development. And as a leader, I think one of the things that it does is it gives you a reshaping in terms of how it is you're going to go out and achieve what you care about. And I think my experience of this course is that people come out of this course with clarity around, what do I care about and what do I want to achieve in the world? And I now know that I have the capacity to get there, and what are the practices that will sustain me and get me there. And I think that's the gift that this course gives people from a leadership perspective. Okay. There's a couple of minutes left. Any final opportunity for questions? No, I'm not seeing any run towards questions. So either we've utterly perplexed you, or we've explained it all so well and so clearly that it's all wonderful. And well, yeah. Let's go with the latter. Either that or everybody was expecting this to be in Spanish and is utterly confused by the fact that I'm speaking English. Okay, so I think we're probably coming to the end then, Clark. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, except for I want to thank you very much, Pete, for your time and your wisdom and being here and sharing everything you know and taking us to that centering exercise, which is something we can do right now.
Yeah.
You know, just get connected, stand up, and start getting centered. So we thank you very much for that. Thank you, Pete. Thank you all out there who came to this call. This is part of our community activities, and we'll continue to have more of these because we want to share wisdom and to the world and share what we're doing to the world. And so this is a part of it. So thank you for being a part of it, and thank you, Pete. And I guess we're finished then.
Yeah, lovely.
So everybody have a great evening wherever you are.
Yeah. Thank you very much. If you want to unmute yourself and say goodbye, that's all.